Missed an episode of your favorite podcast? Choose from over a decade of content in our archives, not just the latest episode. All free at GCNlive.com.
This is your call to action. Get prepared, America. Economy, survival, energy, disasters. This is USAPrepares.com. Informative radio, educational radio. Interact now by emailing instructor@usaprepares.com or text at 434-390-7953. Class, please take your seats. Now, your instructor, Vincent Finelli.
Everyone all set, cocked, locked? Here we go. Your dial is set correctly to USA Prepares. Thank you for being with us today. Jason is engineering the broadcast. Thank you, Jason, for engineering excellence at GCN. I'm Vincent Finelli. Guineith Isaacs is with us live in Australia. Welcome, Guineith.
Hello, Vincent. How are you this morning?
Well, I am well. And you?
I'm feeling pretty good, actually. It's the middle of the night over here. It's just after midnight in Australia. So, but I've got the kettle on, the fire's going, and I'm feeling pretty good. But you know something, you probably couldn't say the same for the world economy, could you?
No. One thing I do want to mention before we get into Deutsche Bank and the world economy, Guineith, from me to Genesis Communications Network, I'm looking at the screen. I have a 1.2 second delay. So you probably have something about the same. So we're looking at roughly 2.5 seconds delay between you and me. So I just want to let you know that we might step on each other accidentally, but just keep that in mind. You want to talk about the economy? You want to talk about Deutsche Bank? Let's do it.
Yeah. Okay. Now, Deutsche Bank is in really, really, really serious trouble. What would you say, Vincent, if you heard that there was a bank whose share price had decreased by over 90% within 2 or 3 years, and was hemorrhaging $1 billion in deposits a day, and as well as that, had just decided to shut its derivatives trading and investment banking branches? Would you say that bank is in really, really serious trouble?
Well, maybe. If I also thought that maybe they laid off 20% of their workforce, then yeah I would. I would say that we're looking at the beginning of a Lehman Brothers collapse.
I would say that you're probably right. And what makes this really concerning is that Deutsche Bank holds approximately half of the securities contracts and so-called mortgages in the second-hand mortgage market and securities markets out there. And the same probably goes for bonds, and the same probably goes for rehypothecated derivatives. And what rehypothecated derivatives means is that, you know, for people out there who may not know, is that, you know, you get a piece of, you hand a piece of silver or gold over to Deutsche Bank, and they hand you a piece of paper saying that you've got, you know, 1 ounce of silver deposited with them or whatever. And then they proceed to take their half. They proceed to take that physical lump of silver and they, quote unquote, lease it to somebody. They literally take it and they give it to somebody else. so that's somebody else to do whatever they want to do with it. And technically that other person's supposed to give that ounce of silver back at some stage, but you know that that's not going to happen. And gold is the same. And, and then they have a piece of paper in their file that says that they have that 1 ounce of silver. And then they take that piece of paper and they sell the piece of paper to somebody. And then that somebody takes that piece of paper and sells it to somebody else. And then they sell it to somebody else. So suddenly you haven't got 1 ounce of silver, you've got 4 ounces of silver, which is, of course, fraud, because there's really only 1 ounce of silver. But actually, it's not 4 ounces of silver that they create out of nothing. It's 100 ounces of silver that they create out of nothing through that little bit of magical, fraudulent sleight of hand. So Deutsche Bank has been doing this for many, many years. The first time I became aware of it was back in 2008, during the 2008 crash, because it's exactly the same thing that Lehman Brothers was doing. They were also rehypothecating silver, gold, mortgages, and whatever other commodity or security you might care to name. And so Deutsche Bank is in really, really, really deep trouble. And I think that probably sometime in the next few days or weeks, or I can't see them lasting months, actually. I think it's just going to be weeks, days or weeks before they collapse. Because they were even in trouble back in 2008, and there was a portion of the economic community that were expecting Deutsche Bank to be the next domino to fall after Lehman Brothers all the way back then. But of course that didn't happen. So this is it. And the key thing about Deutsche Bank is that they are called a linchpin bank. What that means is there's only a few banks in the world where if you've got a junk mortgage or a junk bond or whatever, that you can take it to Bank XYZ, in this case Deutsche Bank, and they will conveniently take it off your hands for you. And that happened, in fact, in 2008, that a lot of these junk mortgages, the ninja mortgages, I don't know if you remember the ninja mortgages. No income, no job, no assets. Those were, or liar loans was the other name that were given. These were all piled onto the books of Deutsche Bank, off of Lehman Brothers, and off of Bear Stearns, and off the other banks that collapsed during that era. And it's really funny because, those mortgages were never ever paid out, and the houses are now lying in ruins across vast swathes of Detroit and other cities. And, so this is it. The mortgages are worthless. They're worthless because nobody's really sure who owns the debt, and they're worthless because the chain of title has been broken because nobody's sure who really owns the mortgage, and they're worthless because the house itself has fallen into ruin. Does that make sense, Vincent?
Absolutely. I just want to make a quick comment. Yes, it does make sense. I just want to make a comment, a generic comment. Class, if you decide that you're going to call USA Prepares, you certainly may. And the telephone number is 866-582-9933. Well, I just want to tell you that our engineer is busy most of the time. So he's not looking at our telephone in the at the network all the time. So if you do call, please let it ring and ring and ring, And what typically happens is during the commercial break, he will be able to get to answering the phone and then putting you in the stack so that I can see who you are. And basically what that means is I'll see your name, it'll say like Tom from Arizona, and that you want to talk about ABC, that kind of a thing. So right now I can see the phones are ringing, I can see the calls are coming in, but I'm not 100% sure they're really for us. So I don't want to answer the phone. I could answer the phone here, but I would much rather make sure that the call is for us, because it could be a wrong number, and it has been a wrong number in the past. So I'm going to let our engineer answer the phone. You can let it continue ringing for a few more minutes until we go into our first break. And, well, looks like we just lost all our calls. But you could let it ring into the break, and it will most probably be answered at that time. I did want to make a comment. So you're talking about Deutsche Bank. You're talking about 100-to-1 reserves, meaning 1 ounce of silver is in reserves for every 100 ounces deposited physically at Deutsche Bank. Now, here's what that means, class. So let's say 100 people deposit 100 ounces each of silver at Deutsche Bank. That means that after they're done renting, leasing, and making paper out of these deposits, one person can get all of his silver back, or 100 people can get 1 ounce back. That's what that means. That means it's gone. And you've got to be out of your mind to put physical silver on deposit with anybody. You got to be out of your mind. Deutsche Bank, anybody. You got to be crazy to do it. I was going to do a seminar about physical silver and physical gold many, many years ago. And I was thrown off of the expo. Not my expo, but somebody else's. And I was replaced with a guy who said, silver savers, that's what you want to do. You want to have automatically withdrawn from your paycheck some amount of money every week. And then that money will go into an account, and at some point, a bank will buy silver for you at whatever price the silver is at that moment. And they'll put it in an account for you, and it'll be stored at the bank, and all you have to do is pay for the storage. And then if you want your physical silver, you have to pay to get it out of the bank, and you have to pay a transaction fee and shipping and so forth. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard of. So I just want to mention that. David in California, thank you for calling. You're on with Guineith Isaacs.
Oh, yeah, thanks, Vincent. Gwyneth? I was interested in this, and I've been interested in it for years, and I'm wondering if you all are familiar with currency speculators and, the idea that the value of the nation can be manipulated through the currency?
Yeah, it absolutely can be, and that's another area that is, with the U.S. especially, is in possibly a great deal of trouble because they've issued most of their currency overseas, and I think we'll like to talk about this a little bit more after the break.
David, would you like to hold? We're going into a break.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, we'll be right back with Guineith. So we're talking about Deutsche Bank. Guineith is with us, David in California. And if you look at Zero Hedge, they say that Deutsche Bank has manipulated and rigged every market it traded in, violating virtually every regulation and anti-money laundering rule in existence. Let me say that again. Deutsche Bank, known to manipulate and rig every market it traded in, and violating virtually every regulation and anti-money laundering rule in existence. That's Deutsche Bank. So when you think about it, I had a question for David. If you look at these banks that would love to hold your gold and then lend it out on contracts, at 100 to 1 or even 9 to 1. Would you trust them? Would you trust people like that to hold your wherewithal, your wealth, if you'd like to call it your wealth? David, would you do that? Would you put gold or silver in the hands of a third party and trust them to give it back to you when you want it?
Well, that's an excellent question, Vincent. And when you remember that Supreme Court Justice Kennedy's son was the guy that lent money. What was he, an executive vice president of Deutsche Bank? And he was the son of the Supreme Court Justice. And he was the only banker in the world that would lend Trump, I guess the first shot was like close to $100 million. So, talk about your fly-by-night schemes and, getting other people's money locked down into shady deals.
When I studied real estate, the term OPM kept coming up. OPM, that means other people's money. So, and Donald Trump was quite excellent when he was trading in real estate, buying buildings. He liked to use OPM. And I'm not saying it's wrong, but it's a lot less painful when you go bankrupt if you've used other people's money, right?
Sure.
And from what I understand, Donald Trump went bankrupt 3 times. And I figured, and I'm not exaggerating, class, I figured that if we are going to have a collapse in the United States, which I believe absolutely positively is on its way, that the kind of person that I would like at the helm during a bankruptcy would be Donald Trump. I think that since he's had more experience in bankruptcies than most politicians, he's the guy I would like to preside over the bankruptcy of the United States because he knows how to pull out of it. And he's done it 3 times.
But he cashes us out, right? By the way, you got to check your numbers. Here's a fact check thing. Has Trump declared bankruptcy 4 or 6 times? That's a Washington Post.
Oh, there's 3 I know of. There's 3 I know of.
Well, maybe those were Chapter 11 instead of Chapter 7. So I guess, there's Snopes option too. But either way, if you look at, there was a book written about the mob and how they basically tricked people in New York City into, running out of the city and buying a suburban home, and it was called White Flight. It was in the 1960s. And so they basically terrified the whites, the mob did, terrified the whites, made them just give up their land in Manhattan and go buy an expensive suburban house, right? They gave up Manhattan property, right? And rather than protecting their own neighborhood and standing fast and being a good neighbor and looking out for each other and having a good neighbor, a good neighborhood by looking out for each other, they allowed organized crime to create white flight by creating all sorts of shady deals and, the mob running heroin in the streets. And so the mob ended up owning Manhattan, and Trump was able to get it from the redevelopment agency. So when you start looking at what a guy like that would do to New York City, now what could he do to the world? So he creates these shady deals, gets everybody running around the world, looking for the paradise, and he ends up with the land in the long run. So it's a shady deal again for Trump.
David, would you mind holding through this break? I've got a couple quick questions for you about exactly this, the white flight in the 1960s. We're talking about white flight, and David, you mentioned that. David's in California, Guineith's in Australia. Well, I remember, I'm 67 years old, and I remember the 1950s, and I remember the 1960s. And during the 1960s, there were riots. There were actually 159 riots, race riots, between blacks and whites throughout the United States. 2 of them that come to mind are the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles. That was in 1965. There was a riot there. It's a pretty significant riot. And then in Newark, New Jersey, that was another one. But there were 157 other riots. And I remember talking to a guy who had an oil company, and he lived in a neighborhood on the East Coast. And the National Guard stood on the corners to protect the homeowners and the businesses from these slash and trash and burn type riots that were going on. Black people were just burning everything in sight. And I'm not kidding. It was pretty serious. And so this guy who had an oil delivery company, when I say oil delivery company, I mean a guy who would deliver heating oil to homes. And it was a common business back then. People heated with oil in the Northeast. Well, he said that he and his buddies in their neighborhood were on the rooftops with rifles. And if there was the riot turning the street corner to their neighborhood, they were going to discharge their cartridges right then and there. National Guard or not, they were going to defend their homes. David, in California, when you talk about white flight, are you talking about that, the race riots? Are you talking about St. Louis, Missouri, in the 1970s, losing about 25% of its population, where the blacks moved in and the whites moved out? Is that what you're talking about?
Well, actually, I'm old enough to have lived through some of those days. I was born in 1955, so I was 5 years old in 1960. And the 1960 census had North St. Louis was predominantly black, South St. Louis was predominantly white, and the prosperity in St. Louis was in the north. The blacks actually were the more prosperous. In the south, they were stuck in national lead was down there spewing on, smokestacks, just dumping lead all over the whites. It was pretty amazing. And then Budweiser was down there, and they had a bunch. St. Louis was shoes and booze. And so the 1964, and the population was going on a million and a quarter. Now today, it's actually just about 25 or 250,000. So it's lost a solid million in what's 1960 today. So it's still losing population apparently, because it's one of those cities that's so dumb that instead of having, they don't have regular Klan there. They got these purple-robed guys that are called the Veiled Prophets. And that's the old money of town. And they're dumb bigots. And they're actually losing a million population, and they're still strutting around like they're in charge. So it's, when you start looking at their policy in 1964, they had the Supreme Court had a Fair Housing Act that was upheld, and that you had to sell property to the honest, the best customer, and you had to give the right to, if some black guy, and there was prosperity in North St. Louis, if some black guy tried to buy a house, he had the right to buy a house if he had the money. And the old bigots were refusing, and to this day, they've refused and refused. That was St. Louis. In New York City, Robert Moses was exactly the same way, except he was more of a position of power of the downtown big money old bigots. And in fact, if you look at Donald Trump's dad, he owned housing projects. If the blacks were forced into housing projects by the redevelopment agency or whatever, their houses were stolen, just like in North St. Louis. Their properties were just automatically condemned, and everybody was forced to go live in Pruitt-Igoe was St. Louis. New York City had a whole bunch of other ones, but Trump owned them. He owned a bunch of them. And if there was a broken window, that was up for Daddy Trump to fix, but the guy wouldn't fix it. And he'd make the place look like hell. He was a slumlord, and then they'd be able to blame it on the blacks. Oh, they didn't ever fix their windows. Well, Daddy Trump owned the place. And actually, if you go to Woody Guthrie, he wrote about this same stuff because he lived in Trump properties back in, I think, the 1930s. And he wrote a song about Daddy Trump and how much of a skinflint and a loser he was. And but he was milking. He milked the early HUD. He milked milked those housing projects. He forced the U.S. taxpayer to triple pay for the same furnaces. I mean, they've got records on Daddy Trump about how he was doing money laundering through the housing project agencies up there and forcing them to, like, he would have to buy a furnace, so he would sell it to his kids, and then his kids would sell it back to him. So they'd triple the price by doing that. And then the government would end up buying it. So they would bill it to the government. So you look at Donald Trump as somebody who knows how to milk the government. He's been doing it ever since Grandpa, you know. I mean, these guys are the biggest welfare cheats that there are. They're the ones that never fix the window, and they blame it on the blacks. So when you start getting a hot, say, for example, a hot summer day in New York City, and your window doesn't work, and well, how about a freezing winter in New York City, and your window's still broken? I'd riot too, except most of those riots, I mean, I've taken part in protests since I was a little kid. I was 8 years old the first time I got arrested for a grape boycott, of Cesar Chavez. And the idea that what cops call a riot is not a riot. I've videotaped enough of them to know that 52 priests getting arrested, in service for the homeless, they'll still call it a riot. They'll have 150 cops out there to arrest 52 priests and nuns and lawyers and, lay workers and all sorts of people who are trying to do service to the homeless. And the cops, it's actually true out here in San Francisco back in 1993. They had this 52 priests and nuns and lawyers get arrested. They had a shooting at Mission High School. Not a single cop showed up at a shooting at Mission High School because they were all down there getting cops arrested and calling it a riot. So if you're saying there were 150 riots in America, I would question that.
Well, that's what the news reported. You can look it up on the internet right now, that they were saying that there were 159 riots relating to race. Now, I do know that people were absolutely terrified of the slashing and the burning that was going on in neighborhoods throughout the United States and cities.
Well, there was
I do know that.
Of landlords would burn their own properties. In fact, if you look at, you remember when, who was that kid that got beat up by the cops in L.A., and Rodney King. Now, if you look at the history of what neighborhoods burned down, you remember Hong Kong was a 99-year lease for the British, right? That lease was going to run out in a matter of a few short years. I think it was like 1996. And Rodney King was, about 92 or 94 or something like that. So it was just a couple of years, and all these rich Chinese were terrified that communist China was going to come and steal their Hong Kong land. So they were being allowed to buy land in South Central. Well, if they burned down the land, they'd get it at tax auction. They'd get a grant to steal the land. And so if you look at the history of the burning during that, the famous police chief Gates, was his name, he ordered all of the top people, like they knew that the jury was going to come in late in the afternoon. So he ordered all the top people, all the ambulance directors and all the fire chiefs and all of the top cops. He ordered them to go to a gas station in South Central, but he didn't turn on the telephone there. And he had all these guys ordered to a place that had no telephone service in there. They were dealing with walkie-talkies at best, right? No cell phones back then. And these guys were locked into a situation where all of a sudden that afternoon, LA's a big place, and you have a bunch of grease fires, and you have kids burning trash in the backyard, and it catches fire and stuff like this. They didn't respond to a single emergency until because of that, and because they censored all of the top leadership. You can look that up. They allowed South Central to catch fire just to sell it to the Chinese. So there's a lot of phony stuff that goes on in the name of these riots. Chief Gates had to actually quit because of that. When it became known that he took the top people and censored them, kept them incommunicado, I guess is the expression. And he ordered them in there. You can look it up. It's a famous deal where end of Hong Kong and all these rich people wanted to buy it. Now you look at rich real estate developers, they've latched onto something crooked as that. Well, what do you think Trump's doing right now, sealing the border? At planting time, he seals the border. At harvest time, he seals the border. He makes sure no crops can get in or out. Now we've got floods all over the Midwest, a lot of cleanup, no hired help. He's making sure that everybody's land gets lost at tax auction this year.
You mentioned Hong Kong in the 90s, and I know for a fact that there was a U.S. bank by the name of Marine Midland. It's a very old bank. It's headquartered in Buffalo, New York. And Marine Midland was a division of HSBC. HSBC stood for Hong. HSBC stands for Hong Kong Shanghai Bank Corporation. Yeah. And they were literally terrified of exactly what you were talking about, the end of the 99-year lease of Hong Kong. You also mentioned you mentioned Woody Guthrie. Now, Woody Guthrie was known for singing songs of protest, and his son was Arlo Guthrie, another guy who sang songs of protest. And I've got to hand it to the protesters, because they wake us up and they bring some light onto a lot of criminality. And I really think it's wonderful when people protest for the right reasons.
Hey, your guest is in Australia, right?
Yes,
she's probably familiar with HSCB or BC too, right?
Oh yeah, I know. I think I've done broadcasts on them before, haven't I, Vincent?
Yes, you have.
The money laundering going back 150 years to the British Empire and their opium trade into China. And HSBC and the East India Company were working hand in fist, operating a drug cartel for, all the kings and queens of England.
David, would you like to stay with us through the break?
Oh, sure, but I don't want to hog it from her, because she's a real guest, right?
Interesting topics this morning. Guineith Isaacs is with us live in Australia. David in California, San Francisco. And David, you mentioned National Lead Company. Well, National Lead Company sold paint under the name Dutch Boy Paints. And it was a pretty big name in paints. They sold a lot of paint. And they used lead in the manufacturing of paint. And they polluted the river. They were on the river in New Jersey, at Perth Amboy, New Jersey, and they had a huge smokestack on their manufacturing factory property. And there were a lot of protests to get them to stop polluting the Raritan River. And it wasn't working so well. So one industrious guy decided to climb up the smokestack with a parachute on his back, and literally climbed to the top of the smokestack and put the parachute over the smokestack, causing the smokestack to back up and smoke out the factory. And that worked. That literally worked. And during this protest, the protesters were at the entry point, the front gate, if you will, to the factory. And they prevented people from, the employees, actually, I should say, the management from getting to work. And the management was trying to run the factory. And this is urban legend, so I keep that in mind, class. So the protesters were pretty effective, and they stopped the management from getting to their desks, if you will, and to the factory floor. Well, the management was pretty bright, and they said, you know what, we don't have to go through the front gate and be pelted by these protesters. We can go by boat and go to work by through our dock on the river. So that's what happened. They went to work by boat until the protesters burned down the dock. So, you got to hand it to some clever protesters. Eventually, they got the plant shut down. And this plant was providing, all kinds of diseases to the area. Cancers. I mean, this was a really serious problem. And it became a Superfund cleanup site, I believe, in the amount of $79 million to clean up.
Right?
Yeah. So it was a pretty big deal, and it was pretty serious. So class, when you look at those nice, clean labels on some of the products that you buy, the factories are probably nothing like the image that you have of those companies that have those wonderful white labels. David, would you agree with that?
Yeah, the only thing I would wonder about, too, when you think of paint, and especially paint back then, lead paint, it usually had some kind of volatile, not varnish, what do you call it? It's an ether.
A VOC. It had VOC, volatile organic compounds, yes.
Right, yeah, so the loading on to the dock, if they burned the dock down, they'd take a chance of catching the river on fire, right?
That's right. That's right. It was a very serious event, but the single event that really shut down National Lead's Dutch Boy operation in Perth Amboy, New Jersey, was this parachute. I mean, that was just sheer brilliance on the part of the protesters. Now, of course, I'm not advocating violence, but you know what? Sometimes I guess that's what happens, and that's what happened with the first American Revolution. Violence.
But when you're talking about putting that parachute up, I mean, unless he was carrying a spike pole or something like that, he'd have to be sticking his face into that smoke in order to get it all the way around, right?
That's exactly right.
So there'd be. I mean, that's one of your patriots that dies for his country, kind of stuff. Hey, if I could ask your guest though, it sounds like HSBC might have been part of Gladio. And I'm wondering if you're familiar with Gladio and whether you think they are.
Okay, I'm not so familiar with Gladio, but I know that HSBC, going back even 200 years, they were, we've got a little puppies here. That's probably what you can hear in the background. They were laundering money, and they were running drugs, and they were, they were operating a drug cartel for the British Empire, for the kings and queens of England.
Right, smuggling opium into China, right? And they were the bankers for the opium peddlers?
For the express purpose of making the Chinese people dumb so that they could dominate them and take over. And it's exactly what they're doing to basically every population out there, except these days it's not opium, it's fluoride compound.
Any number.
David, we're going into top of the hour break. Would you hold long enough to give our engineer your telephone number if you'd consider doing that? I'd like to call you sometime in the evening.
Oh, sure.
Okay. So, Jason, would you please put David on hold and communicate his telephone number to me? Guineith and I will be right back. Everyone all set? Cocked? Locked? Hour number 2 of USA Prepares. Guineith Isaacs is with us. We're talking about Deutsche Bank. We're talking about how precarious the financial system is. We're talking about how highly leveraged the system is. And we're talking about how you may not be able to get your physical silver, your physical gold out of the bank if you have chosen to deposit it there. And I wanted to let you know that safety deposit boxes sound like one of the dumbest things on the planet to me. Why would you or anyone else entrust your valuables, whether it be a handgun, whether it be jewelry, whether it be documents? Why would anyone entrust valuables to a third party whom you hardly know, that has rules of operation. So, for example, Sundays they're closed. They close at 5 o'clock. They're called banker's hours. Why would you entrust your valuables to people who would have absolute, total physical control over them, and you pay them by the month or by the year to secure your valuables from you and everybody else? Why would you do that? I know people say, well, they've got some valuable jewelry, but it's too valuable to keep it at home. But it's not too valuable to wear it sometimes. That's crazy to me. You need to find a place in your home that is secure. Whether you have to saw up some floorboards and put a safe in the floor, a fireproof safe or a fire-resistant safe in the floor, put a rug over it, or in the wall, or in the basement, or in the garage, or wherever it may be. And you need to make sure that your family knows where it is in case something happens to you. But why would you want to entrust valuables to people you hardly know and probably don't even like? Why would you do that? Guineith, any quick comments?
Okay, I would absolutely agree with that. I have had safety deposit boxes in the bank in the past, but not anymore. I don't trust them anymore. I got a bit educated on that point. Banks are basically at the moment, there's not any bank that is anything other than a completely satanic cartel. I'm not talking about necessarily the teller that you go to at your local branch, but I am talking about the senior management. And the evidence that I have of that, a little while back I had to go into my the branch of my physical bank, to do some business there. And I saw in a glass case an advertisement for wearable microchips, okay, where within a year, within 6 months to a year, you're going to, that there's not going to be any ATM cards anymore, there's not going to be any MasterCards or Visa cards, it's all going to be microchips. And you're going to have to get one of these microchips to conduct your banking, unless you deal in cash. And they're going to phase out cash. And their excuse is going to be, well, we want to do away with money laundering, which is the most ridiculous excuse ever, because it's the banks that are doing the money laundering. It's the banks that have always done the money laundering, through money market manipulation, the gold and silver thing, through mortgages. Why hasn't the mortgage market collapsed already? Well, the housing market and the mortgage market hasn't collapsed because it's propped up by money laundering money, where people go and they buy a house, and then they, with dodgy money, and they pay cash for the house, and then they keep it for 2, 3, or 5 years, and then they sell it. And then they take the profits, and as far as anyone knows, the profits that they have come from that house, And if they've made a profit, well, that's okay. If they've made a loss, well, it doesn't matter anyway, It was all dodgy money in the first place. This is the business model, and that's why the housing market hasn't totally imploded, which it should have done. We were talking the other week about, $1 million for a terrace house. In the inner suburbs of Australian capital city. It should. That's just totally unsustainable prices. There's no way that people can afford that sort of mortgage, And it's really messing with the whole structure of society, because then you've got, it goes to this level. You've got in the US Bernie Sanders saying that he wants a $15 minimum wage. Well, in Australia, we've got a $22.50 minimum wage or something like that. And guess what? It means that the businesses' expenses go up And as the business's expenses go up, the price of goods go up. And as the price of everything goes up, which means inflation, which drives pressure for higher wages. And it's a inflationary death spiral at that level, but people need the higher wages because on some level they're paying for somebody's mortgage. Even if they're renting, that rent money is going into the landlord's pocket, but a large chunk of it, in fact probably most of it, in some cases all of it, is going to paying off the mortgage on the property. And 99% of properties out there, I would say, have mortgages. It's only a very rare person these days that actually owns their own home, you know, no matter how humble that house might be. You know, but I've got something to say. Any mortgage out there, if you have got a mortgage and you have decided that that mortgage, by the way, this is not financial advice, okay? This is absolutely not financial advice. I'm just saying what I would do in that situation, okay? If I had a mortgage and I found that the payments were getting unsustainable and that there was a danger of me not being able to make the payments, what I would do is I would stop paying the mortgage and I would let the bank challenge me on the mortgage. I would let them say, well, we're going to foreclose, and I would say at that point, okay, well, I'm going to dispute the legitimacy of the mortgage in the first place. I'm going to ask you to produce the note. And that is the original mortgage note that should have been signed in front of a judge for the mortgage to have been initiated in the first place. And I would be checking the judge's signature, and I would be going through if they can produce the mortgage note, which probably they will not be able to produce it. And they will threaten you, and they will puff hot air, and they will call you three and 4 and 5 times a day, and they will say, we're going to force you into bankruptcy, blah, 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 blah. But if you dig your heels in and say, well, it's going to end up in court because I'm not just going to let you send the sheriff around to change the locks. I'm going to dispute this mortgage. I'm considering that you have issued this mortgage fraudulently, and I'm going to ask you to prove the chain of title and produce the note. And if you do that, I can just about guarantee that that bank will huff and puff, but you won't lose your house. Because you can say to them, if you send the sheriff around, I'm going to sue you. If you send the sheriff around to boot me out and change the locks, I'm going to sue. Because I consider that this mortgage was fraudulently issued in the first place. If I was in that situation, and by the way, a similar thing would apply to property taxes, because every municipality out there is a corporation. And I went into that the other week, you know, and that is actually something where I have actually done that. I challenged my municipality on, you know, the legitimacy of the invoice, and ultimately they were unable to prove it, and they haven't withdrawn the invoice, that they haven't been able to lawfully collect on it either. Because they put out a supposed court order saying that, well, you've got to pay this or we're going to reclaim your property. And I pointed out that the judge's name on the court order didn't exist, that judge was not actually a legitimate judge. And I wrote to their lawyers. They thought that they could frighten me by getting in some big-time lawyers, you know, the $1,000 an hour type from Melbourne. Well, I wrote to those $1,000 an hour type lawyers that they got from Melbourne, and I pointed out that they, you know, the judge's signature that was on there was, you know, I couldn't trace the judge. Every judge has a registration number. There was no registration number for the judge, and there was no record of his even being a judge or even existing on all of the legal registers in this state. There wasn't even a lawyer registered under that name in this state, registered to practice law. And you know that every judge out there, Vincent, starts his life as a lawyer. You know that, don't you? And I think the class probably does as well, or they ought to. So if you get somebody who claims to be a judge, it means that first of all, they had to start life as a lawyer.
Guineith, you mentioned something about mortgages, and I'd like to share with the class something. It's kind of interesting. So where does money come from? Well, some will call it money. Doesn't really mean money in the real world. It means digits. It's a concept. And where does it come from? Well, it's lent. Much of it is lent into existence. What does that mean? So a guy, gal goes and buys we'll just say $100,000 house. I don't know if you could do that today. I don't know where you could find one that inexpensive, but let's say you could. So you borrow, let's say, $100,000 on this particular house, and a mortgage note is created, and right then and there, $100,000 of never previously existed currency is created right then and there. Money that never existed, created from the mortgage note, the new mortgage note. That's how it is lent into existence. We're going to a break. What was that, Guineith?
I meant to say that. You're absolutely right.
When we come back, I'm going to tell you a very short story about what happened to me in the president's office of the bank. This was a large bank. This isn't just a couple branches. This is a nationally well-recognized bank. I'll tell you what happened when we come back. Guineith Isaacs is with us. In class, back in the 1950s and the 1960s, I was in elementary school and high school. In the 1970s, I earned a BS degree and an MBA, BS in Finance and Economics, Master's in Business Administration, Finance and Economics. I have the dubious distinction of having received one of the lowest grades ever in the history of education. I received an F- during my time in college. I challenged one of my professors, and as a result of challenging him this one time, it took 10 seconds for me to receive an F-, but I did. So when I talk about higher education, I'm talking about the bachelor's degree or master's degree or even a doctorate. What that means to me is that the person was able to sustain that much time in class and regurgitate enough information to pass the test. That's what a degree means to me. Well, during my studies of 6 years of finance and economics, I learned a lot about finance and economics. But what I didn't learn was about something called securitization. So what I'm saying is, even though I spent 6 years reading and studying and being in class and taking tests and making presentations in front of the class, I never learned about something called securitization. And I happened to be in the president's office. I was a computer jockey back then, and I was designing computer systems for 3 of the largest banks in the country. I'm talking about credit card banks, national credit card banks, and you know the names of all of them if I were to tell you. But I was in the president's office describing this new system I was building for the bank to the president. And in walks the marketing guy, the marketing vice president. And he tells the boss, hey, listen, we're about ready to securitize a portfolio. And what does that mean? That means and I was aghast when I heard this. I didn't quite understand it. I was trying to figure out what he meant. But I was just kind of in a meeting with just me and the president, and the marketing guy walks in with this great news. What that meant was they had $1 million. The bank had $1 million worth of debt. People had charged up to $1 million, and we segregated them. We said, okay, this group of credit card holders has run up $1 million worth of debt. And great news because we can sell it. And that was a foreign concept to me. How do you sell something that someone owes to you? Well, it's common now. But back in the 1980s, the mid-1980s, that was a brand new concept, selling something that someone owes to you. And that's what we did. And whenever we got $1 million in a group of credit cards in a portfolio, we'd sell it to a big investment bank. And what they would do, in turn, is they would take $1 million portfolio from one bank, $1 million portfolio from another bank, and another $1 million, and they would bundle these all together, and then they would sell them to other banks. So now you have all this jumbled up debt, and then it gets resold. A fraction of it will go to one bank, another fraction will go to another bank. Now you'd have multiple banks owning a portion of a huge amount of debt. And then it would get cut again and again and again. Now you'd have a whole bunch of banks owning fractions of several portfolios of debt. It's the weirdest thing, right? Well, the same thing happened with mortgages. So you had mortgages that were bundled up and sold to banks who bundled more mortgages up and then cut them into little pieces and sold them to investors. So you might own a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a percent of 1,000 mortgages. But you don't own a mortgage. You own a fraction of 1,000 mortgages. So now the question is, if 1,000 people own mortgages, who owns what? And that's what Guineith is talking about. It's almost impossible to figure out all the owners because over time they're sold and sold and sold and resold and resold. And now it's really complex. And it's to the point where I don't think they can figure out who owns it. Is that what you're saying, Guineith?
That's exactly what I'm saying. And I'm saying so that if you threaten...
Right, hold that thought. So, class, just to recap, new, and we'll call it money for just for an example's sake. New money is lent into existence when someone signs a mortgage note. Never existed before was that amount of money. So we'll just use the number $100,000. Now, if you believe that money never existed in the first place, but yet when you sign that mortgage note, you're on the hook to repay something that was created out of thin air. It never existed. It's not backed by anything other than the threat that if you don't pay it back, you will lose your house or your car or whatever it is that you got that loan for. Okay, so it never existed. You have to pay it back with real money. So it wasn't real money to begin with, but you have to pay it back with real money. Now think about that. So if you borrow something that never existed, that was created out of thin air, and yet you have to repay it with real money that you actually have to work for, go to work and earn the money to repay that money that never existed in the first place. Why should you have to pay it back, and why should you ever have to pay it back? Because it wasn't real in the first place. And that's what Guineith is saying. And not only that, that note that you signed had been cut up so many times and resold to so many other individuals or investors or other banks that no one really knows who actually owns it. So it never existed. It's been cut up into tiny, tiny, minuscule pieces. No one really knows who owns it, but you have to pay it back. And Guineith is saying that if you're in a situation where you can't pay it back, why should you? Now, this is not financial advice. I'm not advising you to do this. But if you understand the concept, why should anybody have to pay it back? That's the whole point. Guineith?
Yeah, that's absolutely the truth, Vincent. I'm just saying what I would do if I was in that situation, okay? So I'm absolutely not advising anyone else to go out and do that sort of thing. I own my own home, my own farm, my own house, freehold, in fee simple, and it hasn't got a mortgage note on it. And I'm happy that way, and I don't think I ever would get a mortgage again now. And I've had them in the past, and I've paid them off.
Guineith, here's something that is probably one of a few common threads among some of the USA preparedness instructors. Now, we've never cast a net to say, all y'all who meet this criteria, you can be eligible to apply to be a USA preparedness instructor. Never has anything like that happened. But what did happen, and what has happened, is people who I think have a common set of values, common logic, common understanding, people who want to learn more about everything, those seem to be the kind of people who we are. And when I meet people like that, I invite them to be faculty. And that's how it happens. Now, one of the things that is a common thread among the faculty is many of us have worked hard, saved our wherewithal. You can call it money, you can call it whatever you want. We've saved rather than squandered. We have not gone to Disney in favor of buying tools, buying equipment, putting that savings toward land and buildings and infrastructure on our properties and own them. That's one of the common threads. And frankly, I cannot imagine having a gun to my head, having to go to work every day with that gun to my head to make car payments, appliance payments, all the payments that most people make because they have those guns to their head, because they have not saved in the long run, starting when they were children, for a life of owning assets. So, yes, we own our own farm, free and clear, just like you do. And others do too. Others own their own property because they have not taken those vacations, not squandered the money on watching guys with short pants chasing a ball in a theater or a coliseum or a ball field, and have not gone to the movie theater and squandered money for, I don't know, $10 popcorn, or Starbucks coffees, things like that. You don't have to do that. You don't have to squander money. And if you don't squander money, you can do things as Guineith and I. I still have a hammer, an Estwing hammer, Estwing, top of the line, best you can get in my opinion. I bought it probably in the 70s. It's an American-made hammer. I still have it. So instead of squandering money on going out to eat, I avoided that. How much was it to go out to eat? $1.85. You could have lunch for $1.85 back in the 70s. Instead of doing that, 10 lunches bought me a hammer, and I had 50 cents left over because the hammer was $18. That's the kind of stuff you can do. But you have to understand those values, and you have to delay or defer or avoid squandering money so it's easier in the long run. Because right now, there are people who are way past retirement age who can't retire because they can't afford to retire because they bought a car. And the car comes with a 84-month payment obligation or a 60-month payment obligation. And the vehicle will be shot, worn out, and trashed long before the last payment's made. So if you can do what we do, we don't buy expensive cars. A lot of money for a car for me, a lot of money. is $3,000. That's a lot. That's an enormous amount of money for me. I'm not going to buy a $60,000, $70,000 truck. It's insanity, in my opinion, to do that. Do I need a truck? Absolutely. Absolutely. I cannot farm without a truck. Cannot be done in where I am. It's impossible.
Yeah.
So I need a truck. And how much was my truck? $3,000. 0.00. And it frosted me to have to pay the state of Missouri a registration fee and a title fee and a license plate fee in order to operate my vehicle without being picked off by the local gendarme. Because if I didn't have a gun to my head, I wouldn't have done it. I'd ride around without tags. As a matter of fact, class, literally, if you look at any of the vehicles that I drive, the license plate is the dirtiest, filthiest thing on the vehicle. It looks like whoever washed the vehicle washed everything but the license plate.
Yeah. I'll tell you what, Vincent, I would like to make a comment here. There's probably a lot of people in the class who are thinking, well, you know, you might have had some lucky breaks that we haven't had. But, you know, maybe that's true. With me, I actually did have a wealthy cousin who helped me out when I was younger. But she loaned me money, and I paid the money back to her. Okay? And I had the mortgage that I'd taken out, that she took out for me, so that I could buy the farm. I paid her back within 4 years. And, you know, that's the reason why I have this farm now, is because that's the same capital that, you know, originally came from me, you know, from my cousin giving me the mortgage all those years ago. But I've got something else to say. You might think, well, I don't have a wealthy cousin to lend me money so that I can buy a farm. Yeah, but you probably have a backyard, okay? And I have a habit. I do have a habit. Every time when I go into town, I go into the local nursery. And when I'm in the local nursery, I buy a tree, or I buy seedlings, or I buy seeds. And I take them home, and I put them in the garden. And that's how I build up my garden. And as a result, I have a lovely vegetable garden. You know, this time of year, it's you know, it's been a dry year. It's still getting going. So we've still got a couple of months of winter, 2 or 3 months of winter left. I'm going to have food in my garden, especially once the weather starts to warm up. All the seeds are going to grow, and I'm going to have food in my garden. If you have a rental property, and each time you go into town, you make a habit of going into the local nursery and getting some heirloom seeds. Find a nursery near you that sells heirloom seeds and heirloom trees and heirloom seedlings, and go and buy a punnet of seedlings every time you go into town. Go and buy a packet of heirloom seeds from a nursery that sells them every time you go into town. There's still old-time nurseries out there, old-fashioned nurseries. Walmart hasn't swallowed them all up yet. And if you do that, and if you take those seeds home and you plant them in the garden and you learn how to garden, okay, you'll eat, which, you know, in the coming collapse is a lot more than what a lot of other people will be doing. And if you think to yourself, well, you know, they're pretty expensive. How many times have you gone into the supermarket and bought, for instance, a bag of garlic? I don't know if you knew this, but a lot of that garlic, if you, instead of buying one bag of garlic bulbs, you know, if you buy 2 bags of garlic bulbs and then take one of those bags and then break it up into cloves and plant the cloves of garlic in the garden at the appropriate time of the year. Do your homework and find out how to grow garlic, and go and plant a plot of garlic. And you could set up a stall at your front gate, or you could put an ad in your local newspaper, organic garlic for sale, when the garlic is growing, you know, and you'll get yourself a little bit of extra money. And maybe it'll only be a few dollars, but it's about building habits on the inside of you, you know. Or maybe you can learn how to can, and you can can the garlic and sell it, you know. Or you can can it and fill up your own cupboard. And you could do the same with pumpkins, potatoes, sweet potatoes, all manner of vegetables. Just do something.
Hold that thought. Hold that thought. We'll be right back. So, class, I just want to share with you what does it take? What does it take to do what Guineith and I are talking about? So about 55 years ago, I was 12 years old, and I started cutting lawns in the neighborhood. And I cut 1 acre of lawn for $4. And I had a few customers, and that's what I did. And I accumulated that money. I would buy the spare parts or maintenance items for the equipment I used. And the net I saved. And 4 years later, when I was 16, before I was able to drive with a driver's license on the East Coast, I bought a Willys Jeep with a snowplow. And I paid $675 for that Jeep. And you could see the road go by underneath the floorboards because it was rusted and rotted out. I mean, it was a real jalopy, but it worked. And I was able to earn money when it snowed. I would plow 18 inches of snow, 100 feet by 20-foot driveways for $10. And I saved that money. And when I went to school, I worked 18 hours a week while I was a full-time student. And so I had a job. And during the summers when I wasn't at the university, I worked 40 hours a week at a full-time job. And then I had a second job. And then when I got a job in the banking world, I worked 50 hours a week and renovated houses at nights and weekends. Now I'm a full-time farmer, and so I have a full-time job as a farmer because that's what I want to do. And I volunteer 20 hours a week as a broadcaster, for which I don't get paid. That's because I want to. So that's what it takes. It takes effort, desire, perseverance, passion to be able to accomplish something in a lifetime. And did I borrow money? Sometimes I did. I borrowed money once from a bank when I was young. My dad thought it'd be a really good idea for me to learn how it worked, and I borrowed some money, and I paid it back immediately because I was just, the pain inflicted by paying interest was more than I could bear. And when Mrs. Finelli and I bought our first house, we put 25% down, and we paid that thing off right away. We made double and triple payments to get rid of that mortgage note as quickly as possible. And that's how it works, because we're allergic to banks. We're allergic to banks. And by the way, when you talk about garlic, most of the garlic in this country comes from China. And here's just the thought. In agriculture, about 50% of the human waste ends up as biosolids used on the land. So 50% of human waste ends up spread on the land, and most of that is used in agriculture. Think about that. So you're eating human poop. Is it the same in Australia, Guineith?
Yeah, for many years they just used to store it in warehouses, but I think now that they actually do use both the liquid effluent and the sludge on market gardens at Werribee, just outside of Melbourne. There's a large sewage treatment plant there, which is basically a gigantic wetland. And it's actually a world-renowned wetland. There's birds come from all over the world just to nest there. And it's around about 10,000 acres of wetland, and it processes a third of Melbourne's sewage. And that's a city of around about between 2 and 3 million people. So it processes about 10,000 acres of wetland processes sewage from 1 million people. There are farms that use that effluent, the tertiary treated effluent. Okay, so we're not talking about raw sewage here. Secondary and tertiary treated sewage water gets put onto farmland adjacent to the sewage treatment plant. And the farmers buy that waste sewage water off the sewage treatment plant, and their plants seem to do very well on it. So I would say that there the pathogen risk is minimal. You could never say that it was non-existent, but I'm aware that in a lot of areas they use raw sewage water on crops, especially in places like China and Mexico. And that definitely has problems, especially tapeworms. If anyone wants to go to my Facebook page, I actually sent that article to you about the tapeworms. And it just says I would not be eating any fruit or vegetables from China without cooking them first, because of the risk of tapeworm infestation, because you really don't know what they've been using to fertilise their crops. Now, compost of human manure is probably okay, but I would say they're not composting it in China.
Guineith, thank you so much for being with us. I really appreciate you staying up all night to share your wealth of knowledge. I'll see you next week.
Yep. God bless, and have a great week.